So, I mean, your new book. I've been hearing this idea a lot that there is, a Cold War 2.0 going on. When did this second Cold War start? Was there ever a gap between the first one and this one?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the new Cold War essentially began when the way I frame it, when essentially the Hong Kong handover took place. At that point in time, I do believe that people in the CCP were basically had more confidence in the belief that they could replace the United States as the world's preeminent power.
How does that work? How do they make that jump from, all right, we got Hong Kong to we can beat the United States?
I'm only saying that the handover was a very big moment for the CCP, in the sense that something that was part of the colonial heritage was transferred, and essentially Deng Xiaoping held his ground and ensured that while the Chinese, of course, set some limits to their behavior, there was absolutely no check essentially on what their behavior would be. It was basically a trust and belief system. So I think, to 2 points of view. One is that they felt that the West was vulnerable to this kind of concession and to major other concessions. And secondly, the Hong Kong handover, in a sense, symbolized the coming of age of the PRC as a power which not just equal to the West, but it has taken back something which the West had. In India, we like to believe that the fact that India got its independence acted as a kind of a spur to many other countries in Africa and in other parts of Asia to demand independence. And as you probably know, India backed almost all these independence movements. So, in the same way, I do believe that the conviction inside the CCP that finally the time had come for them to essentially, become the preeminent power on the globe. The PRC to become the preeminent power on the globe. I believe we can date it around 1997, and this is, it is very easy to find a lot of studies with some clear metrics and mathematical equations, etc. But the reality is, a lot of that is in a way subjective and how you look at a situation. And when you look at the way in which the CCP individuals that one was in contact with, the way they reacted after the handover, you could sense in them a feeling that, if I can use US terminology, manifest destiny, our time has come, so to speak.
I always knew the mid 90s were the greatest period in human history.
Before 1997?
Before 1997. The Cold War was over. The second one hadn't started. Little narrow golden age.
So I have a question about the start of the Cold War 2.0, which is, so that's 26 years ago. How?
Oh my God, really?
I know, right? I feel old. So did the CCP understand that they were starting the Cold War then? And did the West understand it then? Or did it take time for both sides to kind of figure out, oh, wait, we're in a Cold War?
Look, I'd like to say that if you look at the CCP doctrine, from the very beginning, you will see a doctrine that essentially says that the CCP has the answers to at least the problems of what we now call the global South, but what Lin Biao called the villages of the world, as opposed to cities, which were the developed countries of the world. And the CCP, from the very start, assumed that they had the wisdom and the leadership potential, and it's only a question of time before that leadership would get actualized. So, from that point of view, in my view, the CCP was involved in basically, it had a very opportunistic alliance with the Western world, specifically the United States, against the USSR, for the simple reason that right from the early 1950s, Mao Zedong was chafing at the assumption made by the USSR that the USSR was the fulcrum of the communist world, that the USSR was the leader of the communist world, and Mao was basically saying, hold on, that's basically us, it's not the USSR. So it took a while for the Americans to understand that, up to the 1970s and Richard Nixon. But my own view is that after the Korean War, through, I would say, at least the mid 60s, the opportunity was there to basically come to an agreement with the PRC so far the USSR was concerned. And if you look at the polemics that were there between the PRC and especially under Mao and the USSR, you will understand the degree of what could I say? The degree of distaste and disdain that certainly the PRC had for the communist model of the USSR. So, from their point of view, they wanted to be the preeminent power. At that point in time, it was not certain that the US side would prevail in Cold War 1.0. I think that became certain only by the 1980s, by the time of Mikhail Gorbachev. Till that time, they were not certain. And they assumed that possibly the Soviet Union would be the preeminent power. It was certainly seen as the preeminent power in the communist world, and it has expanded throughout what we now call the global south, etc., etc. So the question is not really the United States or the USSR. It's simply which is the preeminent power, and so which is the power we have to take down. And to take down that power, we will do whatever is possible in our power, including teaming up with so called ideological enemies and people whom, in the words of Mao Zedong, we have poured buckets of filth at you, on top of you, on top of your reputation. And you have poured buckets of filth on top of us. But now let's get together, you know. So, from that point of view, they basically embrace the US as a way of tackling what they believe could be the preeminent power. And because they believed that the communist doctrine would finally prevail over other doctrines, they still believe that. And from that point of view, they came together with the US in the old Cold War, and they were the biggest beneficiaries of that particular Cold War. More than Europe, more than the United States, more than any other country, it was communist China that was the biggest beneficiary of Cold War 1.0.
Well, your book is also called Illusion versus Reality. So, what is the illusion? What is the reality of this war?
Look, the first point I'd like to make is that the CCP has been very good at camouflaging itself. Now, today you're seeing on television screens, for example, you had an unspeakable act of terror on the 7th of October against the State of Israel. Now, the State of Israel was founded, if I may be allowed a small diversion, because of the Holocaust, because of the unspeakable atrocities and the attempt to eliminate the Jewish community worldwide. If you look at the founding principles of Hamas, it is very clear it is not simply Israel that needs to be eliminated. I'm not going to use the word exterminated, they use the word eliminated, but the Jewish people as such are a people that basically need to be eliminated. You look at the founding principles, and a lot of them specifically mention the Jewish people, and of course, many of them mention the state of Israel as well. So when you look at it from that point of view, the reality is that when you have a situation by which the PRC today had an alliance with the Islamists, with the Wahhabis, and I'd like to say, don't confuse the PRC with China. China is not the PRC. The Chinese people are not the communist Chinese. The lower level communist Chinese, the bottom, 80% of them are not the other 20%. Of that 20%, the top 10% are not the same as the other 90%. So these are different populations entirely. So the CCP has been very effective in basically making all of us identify China and the Chinese people with the CCP, and more specifically, the CCP leadership. The CCP leadership has been very focused on being the preeminent power. And as I said, at that point in time, 1997, they had the feeling that now our time has come. And the good news is that under Xi Jinping, they have a leader who's abandoned all pretense of that particular realization. Before Xi Jinping, you had Hu Jintao, you had Jiang Zemin, you had Deng Xiaoping, and they were acting as the good cop. But in their minds, there was always the desire to be the preeminent power. For example, their transformation of industry in China in terms of high tech began during Hu Jintao's period. Hu Jintao, I'm told, he went to a modern building, an escalator, a watch, almost everything he saw around him was made by other countries. And says, hold on, why can't we make them? Why just making parts? And they began a kind of transformation of China into a power that finally hollowed out manufacturing in a large part of the world. So, if I may say so, the illusion is that first, that communist China, specifically the communist leadership, is China and the Chinese people. That's not true. And second, that you can come to terms with communist China. And, because the fact is, it is an existential conflict. And for existential conflict means one or the other system will prevail. Either the system dominated by China and by Chinese characteristics will prevail. By China, I'm now using shorthand for the PRC, or the system led by the United States, I'm not going to say dominated by the United States, and the system of the United States will prevail. One of the two systems will prevail. It's as existential as Cold War 1.0 was, and the illusion is that it is not existential. The reality is it is existential. And that is what I mean by illusion versus reality. Let's have no illusions that we are in a new Cold War as existential as the old Cold War seemed to be in the 60s and 70s.